Hi there. This is my video response for case number 4 or case study number 4 for this week. So I selected chapter 13 in the Kowalski text to summarize and then to analyze through an ethical leadership lens. In chapter 13 of the Kowalski text, Raymond, who is a newly hired assistant principal at a small high school in a rural town, is experiencing conflict with the principal of the school. During Raymond's interview, he was asked by the principal and the superintendent if he would be amenable to staying in the assistant principal position for at least 5 years. Additional questions that the superintendent and principal asked Raymond focused on how comfortable Raymond was with shifting from living in a large urban area to a much smaller rural community. Raymond responded enthusiastically and positively in both regards. He stated that he was excited for a change in pace with regard to living in a small town. Both the superintendent and principal noted that Raymond seemed to be the most qualified candidate of the two that were brought in for interviews. Still, the principal expressed concerns about Raymond's commitment to remaining in the position for 5 years and with his being satisfied with the quality of life in a small community. Despite the principal's concerns, he agreed with the superintendent to offer the assistant principal position to Raymond. When Raymond first started in the role, the situation seemed promising and the principal was pleased with his performance. As the school year progressed, however, certain actions by Raymond started to draw concern and even contempt from the principal. The first issue occurred when Raymond moved outside of the district into a larger town that was 16 miles outside of the town limits. The principal explained to Raymond that the community did not look favorably on public employees who lived outside of the community. Raymond responded that the small apartment he had been renting in town no longer met his needs. However, the principal began to experience misgivings with regard to Raymond's intentions of remaining in the assistant principal's position for several years, based on Raymond's move out of town. After Raymond moved out of town, he received his first performance evaluation. Overall, the evaluation was satisfactory. However, the principal made a note on the evaluation that Raymond needed to act more maturely when dealing with students. This feedback was not accompanied by any specific evidence, and Raymond did not agree with this particular assessment of his performance. When Raymond expressed his displeasure with the principal's comment, the principal replied that it was actually a pretty good evaluation for a first-year assistant principal. The principal also indicated that Raymond's contract was set to be renewed with a salary increase. Still bothered by the evaluation, Raymond reluctantly signed the evaluation. His contract later was renewed along with him receiving a salary increase. Later in the year, the principal received a reference call for Raymond from a principal in Chicago. The principal was shocked to learn through this phone call that Raymond was seeking employment elsewhere for the following school year, especially since Raymond had just signed his contract for the next school year. The principal confronted Raymond about this and brought up the fact that Raymond had promised during his interview to remain in the position for 5 years. Raymond remembered the specifics of the interview differently, stating that all he had said during the interview was that he looked forward to working for a highly effective principal over the next 5 years, not necessarily that he would stay at this particular school for 5 years. The principal also expressed his anger around the fact that Raymond had not informed him that he was looking for another job. Frustrated by all of this, the principal reached out to the superintendent about any sort of legal recourse that he had with regard to having Raymond make good on his promise to stay in the district for 5 years. The superintendent asked the principal, even if there were legal action that could be taken, would he really want Raymond to stay if Raymond is looking for jobs elsewhere? Looking at this situation through an ethical leadership lens is challenging in that both the principal and Raymond have demonstrated questionable ethical behavior. To start, it seems unfair to ask a candidate, an interview candidate, if they see themselves committing to a position for 5 years and then holding them to that promise if such a promise were made by the candidate during the interview. So many different life events can occur during an employee's tenure that will force them to break such a promise. This seemed to have been the case with Raymond. His fiancée got a teaching position in Chicago and mentioned Raymond to her principal. The fiancée's principal was interested in hiring Raymond and reached out to him. Raymond was considering his work-life balance when he agreed to interview for the position in Chicago, because if he received that position, he would be in closer proximity to his fiancée, whom he planned to marry within the year. One mistake that I think Raymond made, though, was not informing his principal that he was going on the interview and that he was a finalist for the position. Regardless of whether there is a legal obligation to inform one's supervisor that he or she is interviewing elsewhere, and I'm pretty sure there is not a legal obligation, in my opinion, there is an ethical obligation and a professional courtesy to inform the supervisor. I believe there's an ethical obligation because it would cause so much undue stress and burden on the principal to suddenly find himself or herself without an assistant principal. The burden placed on the principal could have a trickle-down effect that would likely negatively impact staff and students. When looking at the principal's actions through this case study, he appears to be operating within the ethic of justice paradigm. According to Shapiro and Stefkovich, those operating within the ethic of justice paradigm may ask questions around issues of equity and equality, fairness of rules, laws, and policies, whether laws are absolute, and if exceptions are to be made, under what circumstances, and the rights of individuals versus the greater good of the community. The principal's concerns for the greater good of the community are evident in his desire to have a stable administrative team that has ties to the community. The principal values stability within his admin team, which is understandable given that turnover can present challenges and barriers for the school. Additionally, the principal values the opinions of the community, which is evidenced by his dissatisfaction with Raymond moving outside of the community. The principal knows that it is important to the community that their public employees are part of that community. Finally, the principal believed that Raymond was in breach of some sort of policy or rule when he, number one, did not inform him that he was looking for a new job, and number two, was reneging on his promise to stay at the school for 5 years. The principal was so irate about the latter point that he called the superintendent to determine what source of legal recourse could be used. On a very basic level, this scenario demonstrates two individuals that have different personal codes of ethics, as well as different professional codes of ethics. I do not see this as a matter of who is right or wrong, but rather how the different ethical paradigms can sometimes create conflict if the parties involved do not realize what's happening.